The Kithrin coalition had been screaming into the void for 3 straight days, and nobody was listening. Well, that's not exactly true. People were listening, all right. They just didn't care enough to do anything about it. 17 distress signals had gone out across the galaxy, each one more desperate than the last. Each one basically saying the same thing. Help us, please. We're all going to die. The mining colony on Zirion 7 had been a success story just a week ago. 20,000 Kithrins work in the asteroid belt, pulling precious metals from rocks floating in space. Good jobs, decent pay. Families building lives on the frontier. Kids playing the recreation domes while their parents worked the mining rigs. It was the kind of place that made you believe the galaxy could be a decent place to live. Then the void swarm showed up. Nobody really knows where these things come from. Some say they're from between the galaxies. Others think they're what's left of some ancient civilization that went wrong. What everyone agrees on is this. When the void swarm arrives, you run. You run fast, you run far, and you pray they don't follow. These aren't your typical space bugs. Picture crystalline spiders the size of shuttlecrafts, but made of something that looks like living glass. They don't just kill you and move on. They eat everything. Metal, plastic, flesh, bone, even the air if they can figure out how to digest it. They consume entire worlds, strip them down to bare rock, then move on to the next system like a plague of cosmic locusts. The worst part? They're smart, not just animal cunning, but actual intelligence. They learn, they adapt, they coordinate their attacks. The first wave tests your defenses, finds the weak spots. The second wave hits those weak spots hard. By the third wave, they're inside your perimeter, and that's when things get really ugly. Ambassador Zefka stood in the command center of the colony's main station, watching their final barriers flicker and die one by one. The defensive grid that had taken 5 years to build was being torn apart in hours. Red warning lights painted everything in hellish colors, while alarm klaxons wailed like the voices of the damned. Through the reinforced windows, she could see the swarm moving across the asteroid field like a living shadow, consuming everything in its path. Her communication officer, a young Kithrin named Velti, kept trying different frequencies, different channels, reaching out to anyone who might help. The responses they got back were like slaps in the face. The Altarian Republic, those pompous peacekeepers who loved to lecture everyone about galactic harmony, sent a carefully worded message about thoughts and prayers, as if good intentions could stop crystal spiders from eating people alive. The Centauri Federation was worse. They actually took the time to compose a formal response promising to remember their sacrifice and honor their memory. Memory? Like the 20,000 people still breathing and fighting for their lives were already dead. Like it was easier to plan a memorial than actually send help. Even the Draknari Empire, the guys everyone feared, the warriors who bragged about never backing down from a fight, took one look at the tactical data and decided it wasn't worth the risk. The mighty Draknari, who had conquered half the Outer Rim, suddenly had better things to do than help civilians under attack. The truth was simple and brutal. Zirion 7 was too far from the core worlds, too expensive to defend, and too dangerous to approach. The galaxy's major powers did the math, and decided 20,000 Kithrin lives weren't worth the cost. They'd write sad songs about the tragedy later, maybe name a few ships after the lost colony, but actually risk their own people? Not a chance. Zefka watched another section of their perimeter collapse on the tactical display. Families were packed into the deepest bunkers now, children crying while their parents tried to stay calm. The mining crews had grabbed whatever weapons they could find, mostly industrial tools converted for combat. Brave people preparing to make their last stand against an enemy that had devoured civilizations spanning millions of worlds. The communication panel chimed one more time. Velti looked up with hope in her eyes, maybe thinking one of the major powers had changed their mind. But Zefka knew better. She could hear the chittering getting louder outside, could feel the station shaking as the swarm tested their final defenses. This wasn't going to be a rescue. This was going to be their goodbye. She moved to the communication console, preparing to record one final message. Not another plea for help, not another desperate call for someone to save them. Just a simple farewell to the stars, a record that 20,000 decent people had lived here once, had worked and laughed and loved and died fighting for each other when the rest of the galaxy turned away. Then something weird happened. Just as Zethka was about to record what she thought would be their final message, the communication arrays started buzzing with activity. Not the usual clear digital signals they were used to receiving from civilized space. This was different, crude, ancient even. The signal came crackling through on frequencies so old and primitive that their communication systems almost filtered out as background noise. You know how sometimes you're trying to listen to music and accidentally tune into some weird radio station from the middle of nowhere? That's exactly what this felt like. Static-filled, distorted, using technology that belonged in a museum. Velti, their communication officer, was staring at her console like it had grown a second head. "Ambassador," she said, her voice filled with confusion. "I'm getting a response, but our systems are having trouble processing it. The signal format is archaic. The message itself was short and delivered in some harsh, guttural language that made their universal translators work overtime. Even after the computer did its best to convert it, the words came out choppy and strange. Acknowledged, en route, maintain positions. That was it. No introduction, no fleet identification, no species designation. No, we'll do our best, or help is coming. Just hang on. Nothing like the flowery diplomatic language every other civilization used when they bothered to respond at all. Just 3 simple statements delivered with the kind of cold confidence that made you believe them. Zethka felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. But it was mixed with confusion. Who talks like that? What kind of civilization sends messages that sound like military orders rather than rescue communications? Velti, run a database search, she ordered. Find everything we have on whoever sent this. The young officer's fingers flew across her console, searching through every star chart, every diplomatic file, every piece of information the Kithran Coalition had collected over centuries of space travel. Minutes passed. The searching icon spun on the screen. Finally, Velti looked up with a puzzled expression. "Ambassador, I'm getting almost nothing. There's a reference to something called the Terran Confederacy in some very old exploration reports, but the data is fragmentary, and there's mention of a system called Sol in the restricted databases." Restricted? Why would first contact information be restricted? I don't know. The classification level is way above my clearance, but there are notes here about something called quarantine protocols and warnings about dangerous evolutionary development. This was getting stranger by the minute. A mysterious civilization using primitive technology, sending military-style communications, and somehow connected to restricted database entries about quarantine zones. Zethka tried to process what this could mean. She decided to try communicating back, to get more information about these mysterious rescuers. Sent a response. Ask for fleet composition, estimated arrival time, and tactical capabilities. Velti transmitted the request and waited. The response came back almost immediately, faster than should have been possible given the apparent distance of the signal source. Again, it was brutally brief. Coordinates: Sol system, 3rd planet. ETA, 6 hours. Recommend civilian evacuation to deepest available shelters. 6 hours. Zethka felt her heart sink, even as hope tried to keep her afloat. Their best estimates showed the void swarm would break through their final defensive perimeter in maybe 2 hours. These mysterious Terrans, whoever they were, would arrive to find nothing but crystal spiders picking through the remains of 20,000 people. Ask them if they understand our tactical situation, Zethka ordered. Tell them we won't last 6 hours. Another message went out. Another immediate response. Understood. Accelerating approach. Hold positions at all costs. There was something in the tone of that message, even filtered through their struggling translators, that sent chills down Zethka's spine. Not fear, but something else. These unknowns weren't just acknowledging the desperate situation. They sounded almost eager. She moved to the tactical display and stared at the sea of red dots representing the approaching swarm. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, moving like a living shadow across the asteroid field. Behind them, the consumed remains of 3 mining stations, stripped down to bare metal and left floating in space like skeletal remains. Velti, keep monitoring all frequencies. If these Terrans send any more communications, I want to hear them immediately. But privately, Zefka found herself facing a terrifying question. In a galaxy full of predators, where even the mighty Draknari Empire had run from the Void Swarm, what kind of species would voluntarily rush towards such overwhelming danger? What kind of civilization developed in quarantine space, used primitive technology, but spoke with such absolute confidence about facing down a threat that had consumed entire sectors? Were these mysterious Terrans their salvation, or had they just attracted something even worse than the crystal spiders outside? The next 6 hours would tell them everything, assuming any of them lived long enough to find out. The chittering was getting louder. The fleet that dropped out of hyperspace 6 hours later looked like it had been built by someone with serious anger management issues. Zefka and her crew watched through the observation deck's reinforced windows as reality literally tore open, and these ships came pouring through like something out of a nightmare. Forget everything you think you know about spacecraft design. Every other species in the galaxy built ships that looked like art pieces. The Altarians crafted vessels that resembled flowing water, all smooth curves and graceful lines. The Centauri Federation ships looked like crystal sculptures, beautiful and delicate. Even the Draknari, for all their warrior culture, built ships that had a certain brutal elegance to them. These human ships? These things looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd given up on looking pretty and decided that looking terrifying was way more important. Angular, blocky, covered in armor plating that made them look more like flying fortresses and spacecraft. Every surface bristled with weapon systems, sensor arrays, and communication equipment that stuck out at harsh angles. The lead ship was broadcasting its identification as the UES Indomitable, and you could see why they'd chosen that name. This thing was massive, easily 3 times the size of the largest Kithrin vessel, and it looked like it'd been through every war the galaxy had to offer. Hull patches covered what must have been massive damage from previous battles. Scorch marks ran along its sides where energy weapons had tried and failed to crack its armor. Entire sections had been rebuilt with different materials, creating a patchwork appearance that somehow made it look even more menacing. Velti, Zefka called to her communication officer. Are you getting readings on their weapon systems? The young Kithrin's face had gone pale. Ambassador, our sensors are having trouble processing the data. These ships are carrying enough firepower to level a small moon, and that's just what we can detect from here. But it wasn't just the main ship. The entire fleet looked like a collection of survivors from 1,000 different battles. Smaller vessels that looked like they'd been cobbled together from salvaged parts. Medium-sized ships with jury-rigged weapon systems that defied every safety regulation in the galaxy. And everywhere, that same patchwork appearance that spoke of constant repair, constant fighting, constant survival against impossible odds. When they opened communication channels, the first thing that hit you was the chaos. Not the organized, professional chatter you'd expect from a military fleet, but dozens of different voices speaking in languages and dialects that their translators couldn't even identify. It sounded like a marketplace, a construction site, and a war room all rolled into one. Baker 7 the hammer lead. We got multiple bogies on approach vector Delta. Copy that, Baker 7. Torch Squadron, move to intercept formation. This is Engineering Deck 5. We need 10 more minutes on the main cannon calibration. 10 minutes? Jimmy, we've got crystal spiders incoming. Not a dinner party. Just give me the time, Rodriguez, or your fancy cannons don't explode when you pull the trigger. It was incredible. Somehow, all this apparent chaos was resolving into perfect tactical coordination. Ships were moving into formation with precision that would make Draknari commanders jealous, all while their crews sounded like they were having casual conversations with old friends. The Void Swarm noticed the new arrivals immediately. Through the tactical display, Zefka watched as thousands of red dust that had been closing in on the colony suddenly shifted direction. The crystalline creatures were smart enough to recognize a threat when they saw one, and they were apparently hungry enough to go after fresh prey rather than finish off the wounded colony. This should have been good news, except for one small problem. There were tens of thousands of Void Swarm creatures out there. They'd been feeding on the destroyed mining stations for days, growing stronger, multiplying. Even if this human fleet was as tough as they looked, the numbers were completely against them. Velti, send a message to the human fleet. Tell them the swarm numbers. Warn them about the tactical situation. The response came back almost immediately, delivered in that same harsh language, but somehow sounding almost amused. We can see them just fine. Thanks for the warning. Recommend you move to maximum safe distance and enjoy the show. Enjoy the show? Zeth-Ka stared at the tactical display, watching as a human fleet moved into what looked like an attack formation. Either these humans were the bravest species in the galaxy, or they were completely insane. Maybe both. The Void Swarm was massing for their attack. Thousands of crystalline nightmares that had devoured entire civilizations, turning their attention away from the dying colony to focus on these new arrivals. They were probably thinking the same thing everyone thought when they encountered the Void Swarm for the first time. Easy prey. Another meal, another system to strip clean. They had no idea they just made the worst mistake in their species' evolutionary history. What happened next wasn't really a battle. It was more like watching a masterclass in controlled chaos, an education in what happens when something that thinks is unstoppable runs into something that's completely unhinged. Zeth-Ka and her crew watched from their command center as the human fleet opened fire, and nothing could prepare them for what they saw. These humans didn't fight like any civilized species in the galaxy. The Altarians used precise, calculated strikes designed to minimize casualties and end conflicts quickly. The Centauri Federation employed sophisticated tactics based on centuries of military theory. Even the Draknari, savage as they were, fought with a kind of brutal discipline. The humans? They fought like the Void Swarm had personally insulted their mothers, stolen their lunch money, and kicked their pets. This wasn't the clean, efficient warfare you'd expect from an advanced civilization. This was raw, primal fury wrapped in high-tech armor and armed with weapons that seemed designed for one purpose: making their enemies regret every life choice that had led them to this moment. The first wave of human fighters launched from their ships like angry hornets from a kicked nest. These weren't the sleek, graceful fighters most species used. They were chunky, aggressive-looking craft that moved more like flying tanks than aerospace fighters. And the pilots flew them like they were late for their own funerals and didn't care who they took with them. "Ambassador," Velti whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. "They're flying straight into the densest part of the swarm formation." She was right. Any sane pilot would try to pick off the edges, thin out the enemy formation, create advantageous engagement zones. These human pilots were diving headfirst into the thick of tens of thousands of crystalline predators, weapons blazing, apparently treating overwhelming odds as a personal challenge rather than a reason for caution. Their weapons were unlike anything in the galactic databases. Instead of the elegant energy beams most civilizations preferred, humans seemed to love things that exploded. Lots of things that exploded. Missiles that split into smaller missiles. Projectile weapons that fired round the size of small vehicles. Energy weapons that didn't just burn through targets, but seemed designed to make them come apart in the most spectacular way possible. But it was when the humans launched their ground assault that things got really interesting. Boarding pods shot out from their ships like bullets, each one packed with soldiers and power armor that made them look like mechanical demons. The armor wasn't sleek or elegant like Draknari battlesuits. It was chunky, brutal-looking, covered in weapon mounts and sensor equipment that stuck out at harsh angles. These armored soldiers moved through the Void Swarm's crystalline formations like they were taking a casual stroll through a park. When creatures the size of shuttlecraft tried to overwhelm them, the humans would coordinate their fire with a kind of casual precision that spoke of countless battles fought together. But here's the thing that really blew Zeth-Ka's mind. When their ranged weapons ran low on ammunition, they didn't retreat or call for resupply. They pulled out melee weapons. Plasma hammers that could crack asteroid rock. Monomolecular blades that could cut through starship hull plating. And stranger things that defied easy description. Weapons that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd studied every possible way to hurt something and then gotten creative with the engineering. Watching them fight was like watching controlled insanity. They used tactics that should have been suicide, charging into clusters of enemies with explosive devices, using their own armored bodies to shield wounded comrades, coordinating attacks that required them to trust their lives to people they were talking to over radio while explosions went off around them. Their fighting like death is just an inconvenience, Zethka murmured, watching a human soldier continue fighting even after taking damage that should have put him down permanently. The Void Swarm, for their part, seemed genuinely confused by what they were facing. These crystalline predators had evolved to hunt prey that ran, prey that tried to hide, prey that fought back with fear and desperation. They'd conquered countless systems by overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers and relentless hunger. But humans apparently didn't run when they were outnumbered. They got angry, and when they got angry, they got creative in ways that made the watching Kithrans question everything they thought they knew about warfare. The turning point came when a massive cluster of void swarm creatures tried to overwhelm one of the human boarding parties. Instead of falling back, the humans did something unprecedented. They called in an orbital strike on their own position, trusting their armor to protect them while using their ship's main cannon to clear out the enemy formation around them. For the first time in their species' memory, something incredible happened. The Void Swarm, these creatures that had devoured entire star systems, consumed civilizations spanning millions of worlds, did something they'd never done before in recorded history. They retreated, not a tactical withdrawal or a regrouping maneuver, a full retreat, with individual creatures actually fleeing from human soldiers, abandoning feeding grounds they've been working for days. These things that had made entire galactic sectors go quiet with fear turned tail and ran from a single human fleet that was outnumbered 100 to 1. After the smoke cleared and the impossible had happened, Zethka found herself standing in the docking bay of a human flagship, surrounded by controlled chaos that somehow felt more organized than most diplomatic ceremonies she'd attended. The air smelled of metal, ozone, and something she couldn't identify but suspected was what courage smelled like. The human ground commander who approached her looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone who just led a charge against impossible odds and won. Colonel Tommy Reynolds stood there in power armor that was scorched black in places, dented in others, with scratches that spoke of close encounters with crystalline claws. When he removed his helmet, she saw a face that had clearly seen more battles than most people see birthdays, with scars that formed a roadmap of conflicts across a galaxy. But when she asked him the question that had been burning in her mind since that first impossible radio transmission, his response wasn't what she expected from a hardened military commander. She'd been prepared for tactical analysis, strategic discussions, maybe some political maneuvering about what the Kithran coalition could offer in return for this rescue. Instead, Colonel Reynolds just smiled, not the predatory grin of a warrior savoring victory, but something warmer, more human, something that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. "Why did you come?" Zethka asked through the translator. "When no one else would help, when every other civilization in the galaxy turned us away, why did you risk everything for people you never met?" "Because that's what we do," he said, and the translator struggled with the casual simplicity of his words. "Look, the universe is a big, scary place full of things that want to eat everything else. We learned that lesson the hard way, back when we were still figuring out how to leave our own solar system. But here's the thing we figured out along the way. As long as Earth's spinning, as long as humans are breathing, nobody dies alone in the dark. Not on our watch." While they talked, the evacuation was already in full swing. Human medics moved through the survivor groups with the kind of easy competence that spoke of practice, lots of practice. They worked alongside Kithran civilians like they'd been allies for decades instead of having just met. Language barriers didn't seem to matter when someone needed medical attention or comfort. What struck Zethka most was how natural it all seemed. These humans didn't act like they were performing some great heroic deed or expecting gratitude and recognition. They moved through the evacuation process like it was just another day at the office. One human medic was teaching a Kithran child how to play some kind of hand game while treating her injuries. Another was helping an elderly Kithran man contact his family on a distant world, patiently working through the communication protocols. This isn't the first time, Zethka realized, watching the organized chaos around them. "You've done this before." Colonel Reynolds nodded. "More times than we like to count. Galaxies full of bullies, and most civilizations prefer to look the other way when the bullies come calling. We decided a long time ago that we'd rather be the ones the bullies worry about. That's when it really hit her. The restricted database entries, the quarantine warnings, the primitive technology mixed with devastating effectiveness. Humanity hadn't been quarantined to protect the galaxy from them. They'd been quarantined to protect them from the galaxy, to let them develop without interference from the politics and compromise that governed civilized space. And in that quarantine, they'd become something unique, a species that looked at a universe full of predators and parasites and decided to become the thing that even monsters feared, not through conquest or domination, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to let evil win unopposed. Your databases probably have us listed as dangerous, Colonel Reynolds said, correctly reading her expression. Most species do, once they figure out what we're capable of. But here's what they don't understand. We're only dangerous to the things that prey on others. The Void Swarm learned that today. Around them, human engineers were already working with Kithran technicians to repair essential systems, sharing technology and expertise with the casual generosity of people who measured wealth in lives saved rather than resources hoarded. Their ship's fabrication units were producing replacement parts for systems they'd never seen before, human ingenuity adapting to alien technology with the kind of flexible thinking that had let them survive everything their harsh homeworld had thrown at them. As the last survivors were loaded onto the rescue ships and the evacuation fleet prepared to depart, Zethkar realized that the Kithran Coalition had just witnessed something the galaxy had never seen before. They discovered a species that had looked at a universe full of monsters and decided to become the thing that monsters check under their beds for. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they were on everyone else's side. The galaxy would never be the same.